mind space in the minds of the people. So her organization Prajwala has been associated with rescue, rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors of human trafficking. She's also partnering with several NGOs to create a layer of protection and a whole set of rehabilitative services for the survivors of trafficking. So thank you very much, Sunitha, for joining us here. So as I said that, it is a very important issue that we face today. But unfortunately, I think not much is known about human trafficking. It's very easy to talk about the problems of malnutrition, for example. It's quite well known. But what exactly is human trafficking and how does it affect the survivors? What is the scale and magnitude of the problem? If you could throw some light on the issue.
Thank you, Ipsita. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in HLF today. Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Vijay, for having me here. Well, human trafficking is one of the most, I think, the worst form of human rights violation. And it's as old as humankind, but today the face of human trafficking is as an organized crime, as a $858 billion industry, next to drugs and arms. But unfortunately, people understand human trafficking as sex trafficking. People think that human beings are only sold for prostitution. That is not so. Human beings are sold for various purposes of exploitation. So human trafficking is very simply, if you have to define human trafficking, it's about the sale of human beings for the purposes of exploitation. Now, if you ask me what is the age of a person, age of a human being who's getting sold, the youngest human being that is sold is 1 day old. As soon as an infant is born, India, unfortunately, has perhaps all forms of exploitation, where young babies as young as 1 day and 2 day have been sold in the name of adoption, and then thereafter sold for organ trade and organ harvesting and things like that. So human beings as young as 1 day are sold for adoption. Children are sold for beggary. Children are sold for camel jockeying. Children are sold for domestic work, sweatshops. You also have a huge number of children being sold for circus. I'm giving you the example of children to tell you how from which place it starts. But I think among all these forms of exploitation, trafficking for the purposes of prostitution or commercial sexual exploitation could be the worst form, because if you look at India per se, the global slavery index says that we have 18 million slaves in India. And of the 18 million slaves in India, 80% are the ones in sex slavery, which is brothels, all places of sexual exploitation.
80%?
Yes. And here again, if you see, the youngest child that I have rescued in my last 25 years is around 3.5 years old from prostitution. So even in that space, that is the profile of human beings. Now, unlike other forms of exploitation in human trafficking, where you're able to identify the victim very, very clearly, like in, say, labor trafficking, or in domestic work, or in circus, or in adoption also, you're able to identify the victim because the victim is able to identify and say, yes, I'm a victim. But in the domain of trafficking for the purposes of prostitution, a point of no return is there, where the victim, after a little while, stops becoming a victim and starts normalizing the experience of being exploited. So much so that when you actually go for a rescue, you might see an 8-year-old child in a brothel, and the 8-year-old child is actually resisting your rescue. Saying that is the damage that trafficking for prostitution has. And I don't think it's very difficult to understand the damage when you realize sex trafficking and sex trade is about getting raped 40 times, 50 times a day. by 40 different kinds of men with 40 different tastes of sex. To just survive in that world of slavery and that kind of hell, the person has to start drinking alcohol, take drugs, become a total addict, substance abuser. So, progressively, your body, your mind, your soul, everything is systematically demolished. And therefore, the the human person that you get when you rescue from sex trafficking is a human person who believes this exploitation is what I want to be. I don't want your help. Maybe, this hell is better than your so-called protective home or safe home. So that is something, I think it's kind of an irreversible damage that sex trafficking does to human being, and that is what makes it very different from other forms of exploitation.